Today we're going to talk about the art of Joe Kubert, more specifically his work on the book Tour. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Thomas Patilli. I'm a comic book artist and an illustrator, and recently I picked up this Tour collection. This is volume 3, I believe. I think there was only 3 volumes. I could be wrong. And it looks like these were put out in like the early 2000s. But it collects a lot of Joe Kubert's Tour comics. Tour was a character that Joe Kubert created, sort of like a Tarzan, Conan mashup. I don't know much about the character, and this is really the first time I'm looking intently at the work of Tour, but I am a very big fan of Joe Kubert's work. Joe Kubert is such a prolific artist. There's so much of his work out there. It's hard to be well-versed in all of it, that's for sure. But if you're a comic fan and you're my age and you grew up with comics around the 90s, you may remember a lot of the Joe Kubert School ads that were in the comics themselves. I grew up seeing those ads for the Joe Kubert School, so much so that I really wanted to be a student there one day. That was actually my goal for much of my teenage years. I got a little bit sidetracked and wound up going to another school, but Joe Kubert, through his work and through some of his instructional information that he had out there, whether it was articles that he wrote in the basic training section of Wizard or the instructional books that he put out alongside the school correspondence course. I always looked at Joe Kubert as a sort of teacher of comics, a master of all facets of comic making, and that's certainly what he was. And you'll see as we get into the work of this Tour collection, it's proven pretty evident that he's a true master of the craft. I made a video about Joe Kubert a few years ago, and it focused mainly on Joe Kubert and his inking. In that video, we look at some of his correspondence course that has to do with how to ink. And I mentioned in that video that more than just inking, and certainly more than tracing penciled art, Joe Kubert tends to draw with the ink. I think that's pretty evident in much of his comic art. Above all, with whatever discipline he's working on throughout his comic making process, he's a draftsman first. From the expressive and emotional figure work to the organic lines that he uses for backgrounds and texture and shading and shadow, even down to the sound effects and the lettering, there's a draftsman-like quality to every line that he puts down on the comic page. And that's what I love so much about his work. It's not tight and noodly, it's very expressive and natural. The pages really do feel like they were worked on by a human hand. And although Joe Kubert is no longer with us, so much of his creative energy and emotion remains in the art that he left behind. In many ways through those very expressive and organic lines. So when it comes to learning how comics are made and studying the craft, Joe Kubert is one of the best to study from, that's for sure. I don't want to spend any more time talking about this. I want to get to opening up this book and looking at this beautiful art. We're going to look through the book. We're going to have some of my commentary along with it. And hopefully it inspires you as much as it inspires me to just want to draw and make comics at a really high level. But before we do that, I want to take a little time to mention someone who is helping to make this video possible, and that's Sunny Boy Comics. You can find Sunny Boy Comics on Instagram at Sunny Boy Comics and Whatnot also at Sunny Boy Comics. Sunny Boy Comics is dropping epic comic book content, new comic book Wednesday videos, crazy comic deals, and much more each week. If you're a collector or just a fan of comic books and comic book art in general, you're definitely going to want to follow Sunny Boy Comics on both Instagram and Whatnot. Whatnot is an app that I'm currently starting to learn about myself. It's a really cool platform where you can kind of check out, buy, and bid on collectibles and comic art and comics in a live sort of manner, kind of like Instagram or YouTube Live. It's pretty cool. And Sunny Boy is on there often having a good time and selling his comics and collectibles. And depending on when you're watching this, he's actually going to have his next Whatnot show on June 24th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So you're definitely going to want to tune in and check that out. So once again, thanks to Sunny Boy Comics for helping make this video possible. And if you are a small business yourself, a personal brand, a creator, whatever it might be, and you have something that would be relevant to my audience and would like to advertise that on my channel, be sure to get in touch. Advertising is definitely a way for me to continue to make videos like this and ensure that the channel keeps growing and that I can dedicate the time that it takes to put videos like this together on a regular basis. I like to share things that I personally find cool and interesting, and if I find them to be cool and interesting, it's likely that my audience will as well. So get in touch, help me share something cool with my audience, and in turn, help grow the channel and allow me to keep making videos like this. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's get into some amazing artwork by Joe Kubert and his work on tour. For the sake of this video, I'm gonna start at around page 40 something in this book. The first few pages have to do with sort of like, it's an older issue that kind of sets up the origin of the character Tor. So this would be 20 years after that original origin setup issue. But even just visually speaking, it's kind of interesting to see how the style and perhaps even the content of the story itself kind of matures from this earlier version back in the 70s. I'm assuming they recolored this 70s issue over here. This seems like sort of newer colors on top of older work. There is a different feel to this earlier story. It's beautifully drawn, and the storytelling is just that clear, classic Joe Kubert storytelling. And then, fast forward 20 some odd years later, and you have something like this that almost just feels like something out of like Heavy Metal magazine or something like that. There's, I guess for lack of a better word, a sort of maturity to it that doesn't seem to be present in that issue from the 70s. It also looks as though these are more of the original colors. It doesn't look like this issue was like recolored later on in some sort of digital way. The colors feel hand done. They feel like they're like markers and dyes and inks. It's just really, really beautifully done. It has like a European vibe to it for sure. And this opening splash page here kind of reminds me of The Spirit in a way, where Will Eisner would always incorporate, the Spirit title somehow within the contents of the drawing itself. So here is Tor spelled out in the rock and cave formations. And you can see some of that nice texture showing through in whatever he colored this with. Like I said, it looks like it's marker or some sort of ink or dye or something like that. But for someone like Joe Kubert, who has such a organic, kind of brushy style, it always to me looked very strange and contradictory in a way when they would do like digital coloring on top of some of his older work or even some of his newer work. That contrast between someone who is as gestural and tactile as his style is to then lay computer coloring over it just it doesn't sit well. And I'm not sure if he would have colored this issue or this particular story that we're going to look through. I looked through some of the credits, and it doesn't seem to credit anyone else in terms of colors or even letters for that matter. And having seen and read so much of Joe Kubert's art instruction over the years through his correspondence course and through some of the basic training articles that he would write for Wizard, it's evident that he, is sort of a master at every step of the comic making process. So it wouldn't surprise me, and I kind of only assume that he would have done all of this stuff himself. But again, compared to that earlier issue, that origin setup issue from the 70s, there is like a real just maturity, not only, again, to the style, but to the storytelling here as well. Admittedly, I haven't read this story yet, but having flipped through it, there's a real like intensity to these pages and to even just the visual storytelling. It's very emotional, very raw. and in a lot of ways, like very almost kind of trippy and psychedelic in certain areas. Perhaps that's where I'm getting the heavy metal European kind of feel from it. And it's one thing when you get a story like that from, like an Italian or French artist, like a Mobius or something like that. I think those European guys sort of have a reputation for being very like artsy and experimental. But Joe Kubert in many ways is like a, comics veteran, old school, just get the work done on time kind of guy. Not one to me who would seem to be particularly, artsy fartsy or, experimental. But then again, his style has such an artfulness to it. He just looks like someone who loves to draw for the sake of drawing. I think that really, really shows through in his work. I think of Joe Kubert and Jordi Bernay, an artist like that, as almost being like, jazz musicians as compared to like pop stars, where they're never going to play the same song the same way two different times. Every time they play, jazz musicians, it's a brand new, fresh interpretation of that song. And I feel like an artist like Joe Kubert kind of has that approach to his art making. And so again, it shouldn't surprise me that he has this whole other kind of like very, very artsy, raw, creative, emotional storytelling side to him. And if there's a word that I can use to describe Joe Kubert, I would use the word prolific. And I feel like just this little tour miniseries here is an example of that. These pages are so incredibly dense and worked on. And I mean that in the best possible way. It feels as though you can really feel like his blood, sweat, and tears on these pages. I mean, if you just look at a spread like this, this is not your average sort of like newsstand comic. There's a lot going on here, and there's just a lot of emotion in just a figure like that, and a pose like that, and a facial expression like that. Like a Will Eisner, and Joe Kubert and Will Eisner come from that same era. They're stage actors. If I were to now compare them to actors, we went from jazz musicians to actors, but if they were actors, they would be stage actors, meaning that they're sort of like acting for that last row in the back. It's not about the subtle movements and nuances that film can pick up, but rather the big, bold expressions that a full body can communicate. And, if you have a human character in your comic, why not use every part of that character's gesture and anatomy to further tell the story and I guess, make the reader more and more emotionally involved. On a technical level, Joe Kubert has such a distinct sense of composition. The way he composes a panel and oftentimes the way he composes his pages is very distinct. I feel as though even if you blurred out the images, just me squinting my eyes, I can kind of identify a Joe Kubert page layout and panel composition. And one of the devices that he uses quite a bit is scale. He plays with scale in a way that I think utilizes it to the best of its ability. And it always reminds me that, yeah, that's right. As comic artists and visual storytellers, we can really play with scale. Because ultimately, we're not filmmakers. We can't, go shoot in, the Swiss Alps somewhere or in some far and away kind of like foresty, vast area. We're working with the same size and the same dimensions. And ultimately, it's just a flat surface that we're drawing on. We're trying to create these like three-dimensional, believable worlds on top of it. And if we're telling a story that requires this sense of like vastness and larger than life, otherworldly qualities, it would really help if we understood how to utilize scale. And Joe Kubert always does such a great job at setting these shots up, like this really long vertical panel. He's always really great at doing these vertical panels. I feel like his sons, Andy and Adam, take after him in that approach. You'll oftentimes see both of them utilize vertical panels. And to place your figures really, really small at the bottom of such a long panel, and to have like these, you know, imposing large structures kind of like overshadowing them, it just gives the reader a sense of how big and wide and open the environment that these characters are existing in. This is not like a Daredevil comic where we're in, you know, dark alleyways or something like that. This is prehistoric. There's a lot of space, and there's a vastness to the sky and to the horizon. And you know, if you just look at a blank sheet of paper and perhaps even just an empty panel, it's hard to try and visualize that vastness within these, you know, confines of these panel borders. But Joe Kubert does such a really great job of just playing with scale like that. He's kind of in many ways known for these little Joe Kubert figures. Oftentimes he draws these little, not quite stick figures, but almost like thumbnail layout quality figures next to these really beautifully drawn environments. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of his son, Andy Kubert, and Andy Kubert drew Kazar at the time. And when I was just flipping through this book, when I first got it, this panel in particular, this one and this one here, reminds me of panels that came right out of Kazar. You'd have to imagine that Andy Kubert was heavily influenced by his father, and also, you know, that's how he learned, presumably, to draw comics. Certainly not a bad way to learn, that's for sure. I always remind myself that even though this was 1993, which doesn't sound like that long ago, this is really pre-internet in a lot of ways. I can't imagine that Joe Kubert in 1993 had like an early version of the internet handy. And so all of these, you know, animals and dinosaurs and prehistoric materials and weapons and all that kind of stuff, you know, this all would have been sourced from magazines like National Geographic, or even just, you know, doing still life drawings at museums in your sketchbook and then using that as part of your reference files. When I was a kid, I remember reading that Joe Kubert was a traveler, and he would travel quite a bit with his wife and his family, and he would always be carrying his sketchbook around when he was on his travels, because he never knew when he would be called upon to draw a particular type of environment or, you know, object or anything like that in his comics. And so he would, you know, draw from life and draw from sculptures and all that kind of stuff, and then use that as part of his reference material. So this is before Google and everything that we have today. I think so much of that adds to the life and energy that's created on these pages. They seem very worked on, and there's a lot of energy. And like I said before, you can almost feel, you know, like the blood, sweat, and tears that are on these pages. But none of that makes it feel or look stiff. There's a real life to these pages and to the lines that he puts down. And I think, again, something to be said about never drawing things the same way twice. Even the character, in a lot of ways, sometimes, you know, morphs and changes from panel to panel. Sometimes he looks really kind of thin and lean, and then other times he looks bulkier and more of a face of like a boxer or a fighter. And so much of that has to do with whatever compromising or relaxing position the character finds themselves in. Joe Kubert kind of uses the character to communicate the story and narrative through the character visually. And so maybe from a certain mainstream superhero comic vantage point, that wouldn't be consistent enough to tell those kinds of stories. But for something like this, I really find Joe Kubert's style to be just perfect for this. And I haven't seen this particular story. I've seen some tour stuff that Joe Kubert has done, but I never really looked at it as deeply and intently as this. And in many ways, whether from a storytelling standpoint or just a draftsman standpoint, I feel like this is by far some of the best work I've seen Joe Kubert do in his very vast career. It's interesting to look at this book now because during this month, every month on my Patreon, we kind of do something that I call like a Stay Warm theme as part of my Stay Warm drawing practice. And the last few months, we've been studying different artists and looking at different instructional books. Last month, we did Andrew Loomis, and this month we're studying George Bridgman. And I can't help but see a lot of like George Bridgman anatomy in some of Joe Kubert's work here. Maybe just because it's fresh on my mind, but I would have to imagine that during his studying of being an artist when he was younger, trying to get better as an artist, I would imagine that he would have had access to something like George Bridgman books. In looking at the George Bridgman book, I also saw a lot of John Buscema and Frank Frazetta in that work as well. So it wouldn't be surprising that a whole generation of illustrators and comic artists would have learned some of the fundamentals of anatomy and figure drawing from such a classic book like that. But either way, Joe Kubert's anatomy is just, it's so on point and so inspiring. It makes me want to draw when I see this kind of stuff, particularly just draw the figure. And putting this in the context of 1993 too, that was like the start of that whole like image craze and a certain type of rendering and art style. Looking at Joe Kubert's work here, this is sort of the more artistic and illustrative way of doing all those like lines on a face and, like furrowed brows and long hair on guys. It kind of has all of those elements, but it's just done in such a more skillful and sort of like, again, artful way. I've mentioned it before. I love a lot of that old image stuff as well, but again, Joe Kubert is really like he's the jazz artist, whereas they were the pop stars. And there's nothing wrong with pop. There's space for all of it, but it's just it's interesting to see the difference between the two. I don't think I have yet done a Joe Kubert study, and that's something that I definitely want to add to my list, possibly in a future video. So stay tuned for that. It mentions in the introduction that at one point he brought back Tor as a newspaper strip I believe in the 90s again. And he teamed up with a longtime friend and collaborator, Carmen Infantino. And so these are collected in the book. It's just horizontally printed. So these would have been in those classic newspaper, probably Sunday style dimensions. And these are just beautiful. I wonder where these might have been printed. I don't know if these were syndicated at the time, but these are really, really nice. I'm glad they included this stuff in the book. This is stuff that I would love to see the black and white artwork, the original artwork of. I love these newspaper Sunday strip pages. In this book, there's a sketchbook behind the scenes section in the back, which I'm really glad they included that stuff. This for me is sometimes the highlight of any one of these kinds of like collection books. I love to see the process, especially the process of, like a classic artist and storyteller like Joe Kubert. And it seems here like he kind of, this is the way he draws and writes. He kind of has like a holistic approach to it. It says that these are 8.5 by 11 sheets, I guess, turned horizontally. And this is how he lays out his pages very roughly, and also makes notes about dialogue and some story stuff. So us artists, oftentimes this is how we kind of quote unquote write. We write and draw at the same time. We're kind of visual creatures that way. But even just a panel like that, it's really cool to see how that compares to the final version. Little shot of that panel right there, drawn again. This whole page here would have just been 8.5 by 11, so that couldn't have been drawn all that big. And then this is how it compares to the final image right there. So you can see all that information is really there, and then he was just able to kind of like capture that same expression and gesture just at a larger size, and obviously, include a lot more detail, but all the basic information, even down to, that hard line that he's putting there for the shadow, that's included as well in that little thumbnail there. It's really cool to see. compare and contrast the preliminaries to the finals. I love looking at stuff like that. And then here's some of his character sheets and notes, and some, I guess, what looks more like studies from perhaps a museum or something like that. And it's interesting because I mentioned this earlier, but he says, I try to have a sketchbook with me whenever I travel. In this way, I'm able to remember the details of the places I visited far better than if I had taken a photograph. So that just goes to show the mentality and how it might have been different than today. Because if I'm somewhere, oftentimes it's more likely, even though I do carry my sketchbook around, it's still more likely that I'll snap a quick photo of it on my phone if I feel as though I'm going to have to call upon that one day in a drawing or something like that. But not having that option at all creates just a different discipline and a different mentality. And these older guys definitely had that for sure. Here's a really great preliminary version of that opening panel, splash page, I should say, double page spread, actually, from the opening of this story here. And if you remember, this was the final, and you can see, if you look at the final, how beautiful that is, and then just compare it to the preliminary, everything really is there. All the composition, the idea behind it, the emotion, even the gesture of that figure right there is there. And this preliminary has such great gesture and lighting and emotion. Once again, the composition is just spot on. This would be a very hard thing to then take to final and be able to maintain that same kind of energy. And of course, he does that so well. It almost feels as though this was drawn without any kind of preliminary. It just feels like this was kind of worked out right onto the page in many ways. That's how much intuition and energy shows through on this piece. But it was, in fact, thought out and planned out just like any professional would. And all the notes and all that kind of stuff. This is really, for me, this is the best way to learn how it's done from true professionals and masters of the craft like Joe Kubert, is just to look at his process and others like him. And once again, realize that just with pen and relatively cheap supplies, you can create real works of art and tell really, really exciting and impactful stories. And this is just evidence of that. I hope you like this look at some of Joe Kubert's artwork in this tour collection. It was great to see the comic pages as well as some of the process art behind the scenes. That's the stuff that really gets me the most excited, is when I pick up books like this and there's process stuff behind it. This was a recent pickup of mine and it's been on my table ever since. I definitely want to do a Joe Kubert study. Maybe that's something that I can do in a future video. Let me know in the comments if that's something that you would like to see. Also, let me know in the comments, what's your favorite Joe Kubert book, project, comic? Joe Kubert had a really wide range, and this tour collection is only one facet of such a long and prolific comic career. Really inspiring stuff. I hope you are just as inspired after looking at this as I am. If you'd like to watch how I draw things and sometimes even draw along with me on certain monthly themes that we do, head on over to my Patreon. That's where I'm putting a lot of process behind the scenes stuff, as well as some sort of educational tutorial type of content as well. I'll leave a link in the description below. I have different tiers. Hopefully there's a tier that works best for you. It's been fun to share a lot of different stuff over there and also just communicate with some of you guys in a more relaxed and personal kind of way. So if you're interested, again, that link is down below in the description. I hope to see you over there. Otherwise, if you like this video, please do hit that like button. It definitely helps send this video all over YouTube and help grow the channel. Please do subscribe. I know a lot of people watch videos and have never actually subscribed. I'm guilty of that myself. Sometimes after months or even a year of watching someone's YouTube channel, I realize I'm not even subscribed to this channel. So please do hit that subscribe button. All of these things do help the channel and help ensure that I am able to make videos like this on a consistent basis. So I really do appreciate it. And that's all for this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.